Welcome back to You Must Be Woken, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion. In this episode, we are diving into the complex topic of bias and specifically looking at unconscious bias and discussing whether unconscious bias training actually works for organizations. We're going to explore the topic in greater detail in terms of the different types of bias you might experience in the workplace, and more importantly, hitting the honest conversations around why people are resisting the topic of bias for organizations. And then finally, we wrap up today with some top tips for you as individuals on how you might manage bias, but also how, as an organization, you can implement processes, interventions, and practices which prevent the negative impact of bias in the workplace. Welcome back to You Must Be Woken, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion with her, Dawn Hurst.
And him, Craig Richards.
Hey, welcome back.
Welcome.
In this episode, we're going to be diving into the complex topic of bias. And Dawn, I know this is your favorite topic. We're going to particularly dive into unconscious bias and discussing whether unconscious bias training is worth it. Should employers be doing it? I love that question. We'll also explore whether those courses actually work and genuinely work, and are they beneficial for organizations. And as always, we won't shy away from the difficult and more challenging conversations around bias as well, so that leaders can hopefully navigate this topic in their own organizations. Does that sound like fun today?
Oh, yes. Fun today.
Before we start, shall we catch up? What have you been up to?
Oh, all sorts. My son has just passed his driving test.
Yay!
So,
I don't know, is that a good thing? Has he now stolen your car, though?
Yay! So I do now get chauffeured around, only so he can borrow the car. But it does mean that I get picked up from the train and all of those good things. So that's quite exciting.
It won't bother you because you don't like driving anyway, do you?
Let's be driving. And I've just got back from spending some time with a client in Hungary, and BA did a beautiful job of losing my luggage. Not that I'm bitter at all, but that's been my week.
You did tell me you got some free makeup as a result of BA
that
losing your luggage.
That was exciting. Yeah, right. They gave me a little allowance for essentials. So.
Essentials, love that. Good.
What about you?
So I am fresh back from my lads' holiday in Gran Canaria, which was very good, but very wild. For the first 4 days was pretty wild. And I was telling the guys just outside a second ago, we caught the tail end of Fetish Week in Gran Canaria. So for anybody that's been to Gran Canaria, particularly the gay scene, there's a place called the Jumbo Centre. And it's just full of gay bars
Sparkles.
And stuff. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Sparkles bar. It's very good fun. So we went and we caught the tail end of Fetish Week, which was interesting, shall we say. I won't go into too much detail, but there was lots of leather, lots of human puppies being walked around on leads with tails and things. So it was really interesting.
Fun.
So yeah, we're going to talk about bias today. And my bias around what that meant was, really interesting. But yeah, it was pleasantly surprised. Lots of interesting people. I met a couple of lawyers who were dressed as puppies.
I love
and that really completely changed my mindset around that. So it was really interesting. That was my week. A bit exhausted because the first 4 days were a bit wild before we then calmed down for the last 3 days. And then the other thing I wanted to show you, so you'll notice I have a piece of paper on the table today. My son, right, got so excited by watching some of our podcast, he's written us a little picture that says, "You must be woking," and he's done us a little logo, and he told me to give it to Dawn so that she can see it. So I thought I'd hand it over to you for you to take away. That's our first fan mail from my son with our logo. "You must be woken." There's a picture of you and me at the table.
It's fantastic. And as I've said, your son is very welcome to come and live with me anytime he wants to.
Well, he's definitely keen to come and be be part of the podcast at some point. So I said maybe at the end of the season we will get him in and we'll do
the Christmas edition,
some podcasting with Jake, and he can say hello to listeners. I talk about him so much, people feel like they probably know him already anyway. So
I love that. That's so wonderful.
It's good fun. Good fun. Right. Shall we head on into today's topic? Big topic today, bias. And I know you're something you're particularly passionate about. So as always, I'm going to start us off with a news story related to this topic. And it's a bit dated, this one, because it actually dates back to 2022. But is an interesting way to kind of introduce this topic, and particularly the difficult conversations around this. So bear with me while I just talk us through this bit. So in 2022, the BBC, so for those of you listening from outside of the UK, that's the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is the state-owned television and media company, told its staff to be on the lookout for 170 different forms of unconscious bias, including discrimination against a colleague based on their hobbies. The corporation, which critics believe is obsessed with a woke agenda, has asked its employees to reflect on whether they are making assumptions in the workplace which could fuel discomfort or discrimination. Staff are warned about the risk of inadvertently discriminating against colleagues on the basis of their race, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. But they're also told their treatment of a colleague may be influenced by that person's relationship and parental status, their physical appearance, including tattoos, educational background, personality type, communication style, and personal interests and hobbies. The guidance adds, I'm not finished, by the way. The guidance adds, make it a habit to give yourself time for reflection before you give a response or make a decision. In that moment, ask yourself, am I making assumptions about someone here? Do I have any evidence to back up these assumptions, or am I letting my busy brain run away from me? So that's our introduction to the bias topic. Where should we start with this one?
Well, when you first started and the first couple of paragraphs, I was kind of rolling my eyes in terms of, oh God, here we go again. Because this topic can very easily be made overcomplicated. However, towards the tail end of that, I thoroughly agree with the approach in terms of just take some time and slow down. And I can talk more about the theory of that as we move on. But the first part of that was an eye roller for me.
Yeah, I guess the same here, right? So when I first started reading this, I was thinking, geez, and it is like and with these public entities like the state-owned media companies or with government departments, all of that kind of stuff, they immediately attract more attention than any other workplace for obvious reasons, right? Because they're state-funded and all of that good stuff. So I guess part of me leans into this, oh gosh, they just make life really difficult for themselves with a lot of this stuff that they put out into the public domain, or, sending staff emails about this, that it just feels unnecessary. But you're right, when the guidance then gets into the meat of it and it starts to talk about the things that people can do, it starts to make a bit of sense, and we understand that from our perspective, we understand it. But I guess the challenge for me when I was reading it is we get it because we do this stuff for a living.
Absolutely.
And what it feels like this was missing for me if it was lecturing staff, and we don't see the whole because we're talking about the news article, is the why. And the why are we doing this? Why is it important? What's the impact and all of that good stuff? So it feels like it misses it for me. But I guess when I start to reflect on bias as a topic, it brings me back to this question of why is this important? And the world is changing, right? And so if I think back to when my dad was going to work and we were children, and dad would take us to his company events and stuff, right? And we'd go and see. Everybody looked like my dad. They sounded like my dad. They went in the same direction. They did the same things as my dad. It was very consistent. And it wasn't very diverse looking back. And we didn't know that at the time because it wasn't really a thing back then. But actually, society's very different now. And workplaces are therefore very different now as well. So things have moved on, right? And therefore, we have to understand what that diversity means to how we behave.
But has it really moved on?
Well, we're definitely more diverse, wouldn't you say?
I think we're more diverse, certainly, but haven't we just simply overcomplicated the whole thing?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, we've definitely overcomplicated it. But we are more diverse, I would say, as a country. So if you look at immigration into the UK and the makeup of the UK is vastly different from 30 years ago, right? Would you not agree?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm referring to is not the diversity makeup. I'm referring to the basic principles of how we all co-work together.
Yeah.
Our parents and grandparents' generation was about doing a solid day's work for a solid day's pay, keeping your nose clean, making sure there was no big dramas.
Job for life.
All of those good things.
Yeah.
But there's something quite nice about those basic principles as well, isn't there?
Yeah. And I guess we need to think about the gender diversity that impacts on bias as well, right? What is it? We call them blue jobs and pink jobs, or boy jobs and girl jobs, right? That's very different now as well. And I guess that's changed the dynamic of workplaces a lot in the last 20, 30 years too. But, how we behave hasn't really shifted.
The gender representation has definitely changed, obviously, even in as short as the last 20 years, it certainly has. But when we bring it back to this topic of bias, the reality is every one of us has got them. So what we've got to do is identify what they are and be mindful of how we navigate those. But being able to understand 170 is pretty impressive.
I do this stuff for a living, and I couldn't tell you what 170 biases are. I mean, it's just nonsense. That stuff just overcomplicates it and leads back to your point, right, about you overcomplicate it, you create fear, you create people distrust and all of that kind of good stuff. And we will get into a bit more of that solution stuff as well. But, let's talk a little bit about how or why bias appears then, right? Because we know it exists, even though people might not admit it, right? It does exist. I have bias, you have bias. Everybody in real terms has some level of bias in them. How does that manifest itself in the workplace?
Yeah, so let's keep it really simple. The things it can make us do is the obvious stuff. We recruit people who are like us because bias is simply that we're drawn to things that make us feel comfortable. Yeah. So the more they're like us and the more relatable we are, the easier it is to communicate and work with them. And equally, we can be drawn against things that we're less familiar with. That's a very simple definition of bias.
Yeah.
And the reality is it can alter who we recruit, it can alter who we listen to, it can alter who we seek advice from, who we give the difficult pieces of work to, who we promote. It can really have a significant impact in the workplace.
Yeah. Devil's advocate, right? People will say, but I'm not biased. I just want the best person for the job. I don't care whether they're male, female, black, white, pink or purple. That's what people say, right? So if we're thinking about an honest conversation, what's your response to people who say that?
So there's a couple of things, 2 dimensions really. The first is great, choose the best person for the job every time. However, don't make people's difference invisible because it's very important that we're mindful of people being exactly who they are. And, if you've got the skills, experience or potential to do the role, absolutely you should.
Yeah. That's an important one, I think, about that, not seeing people's difference, because actually you should see people's difference. You do need to understand them. So treating everybody the same doesn't work in 2024, right? Yeah. I remember when we were teaching leadership training 20 years ago, we were basically saying, command, control, one size fits all model to leaders. And now we're saying 20 years later, actually, that's not the best way to lead people. You need to understand your team on a personal level. You need to leverage what works for that individual to get the best from them. And the same applies in this scenario, right? You can't just do a one-size-fits-all model. So therefore, you've got to understand people's difference in order to leverage and get the best from them.
Exactly that. And, this forced positive bias. I'm going to be controversial here because I know this.
Love a bit of controversy.
I know this is legislation in a lot of countries. We can do some positive action to support underrepresentation. And of course, there's a massive difference between positive discrimination and positive action. Positive action being we can fill our pool of talent with a particular characteristic because it's underrepresented, whereas positive discrimination is we would only actually see those individuals for a particular role or a promotion within our business. But the reality is that I see positive discrimination all the time. And that's nothing to do with bias. That's to do with meeting quotas and targets and all of these good things. And therefore, understanding the principles of how to remove bias from our day-to-day is oblivious because you're forcing people into discrimination.
It's interesting, isn't it, that positive action piece and positive discrimination piece. I'm going to be really challenging here and say most organizations think they understand the difference, but don't understand the difference. And therefore, the things that they do fall firmly in discrimination, not positive action, right? Yeah. And we saw that quite publicly with, was it the Navy or the RAF in the UK? RAF, a few years ago, where, there was this basically public argument between the head of recruitment and the head of the forces. Like, it was really public in the press and the newspapers about this positive action piece that they'd done and the benefits or the negatives of it. And I think that just tells us a story in itself, right? That people think they're doing what positive action is, and actually what they're doing is slipping into a positive discrimination zone. And that's quite a dangerous place for organizations to be, right? Because, you fall into a big trap there, right?
It is. And going slightly off topic, the reality is that I have a lot of patience for people who are forced under targets and quotas to make that mistake. Just the setting of targets and quotas forces poor behaviour, including positive bias.
But it forces poor behaviour, positive bias, but it also doesn't work a lot of the time, right? I get so frustrated. We work with, lots of organizations in the public, private sector, and even organizations, parliamentary parties, for example, right? And I get so frustrated when I see all female shortlists or, all shortlists for people of color or whatever that is in different states, different jurisdictions around the world. And I get really frustrated by that because I understand the sentiment of what you're doing, but you're not actually fixing a root cause problem. What you're trying to fix is a symptom. The symptom is we don't have enough women applying to our party to become representatives. So we're going to fix that symptom, right, by making it all female. That doesn't lean into, are the public getting the best choice to choose from, the best candidate to choose from? And instead, what you should be doing is fixing the root cause of the problem, which is, why are women not applying to our organization or to become candidates in our organization? And let's fix that. Because when we fix that, hopefully the candidates will come of quality, and then we can select based on the best person for the role and for the job. And I take that stage further because we've said this before on a different podcast, I'm pretty sure. But I've worked for and with a lot of women in my career, all of whom would be horrified if they thought they were getting the job because they were part of some quota or some target for an organization, rather than because they were the best candidate selected from the best pool of candidates for the job.
Absolutely. Totally horrified. And all you are doing is forcing bias. Forget the discrimination bit, the unlawful bit, you're forcing bias.
Yeah.
And that cannot be good in any way, shape or form, not only for the individual, but for their co-workers, for the culture of the organisation, and indeed to be able to report to some governance that we've hit a target.
Yeah. And I guess that, so if we think about it, so measurement's a big theme for us and the work that we do. you get what you measure, right? So if you're measuring people on hitting these gender or race quotas for your organization, then that's what you'll get ultimately. And sometimes that's at a cost to your organization, i.e., we're just getting any candidate to fill the quota rather than somebody who can do the job really well, add value to our organization and bring success to us, as opposed to they're a face, they're a name in order to hit an arbitrary quota that doesn't really help us.
But this is, again, where we talk about this topic, so many organisations purely focus on primary data. We've got 10% representation of female and next year we've got 12 and let's celebrate. They haven't considered the outcome of what that increase means. How many male have left? How many are disillusioned? How many of the female have left because they feel that the tokenistic appointment? And therefore, what's the actual impact to their bottom line, to their people, to their commercial reputation of not looking at the round? Yeah. And again, all we're doing is forcing bias.
Yeah. And I know, right, because I've seen it firsthand from clients when they get in panic mode. We're not going to hit our target. What are we going to do?
I've had it today with one of my private global clients. Yeah. We've got a year to go and we're 7 markers off what can we do?
And then you're forcing really bad behaviors. And this is where bias then really starts to play into your decision making, because you're leaning towards just hitting the target rather than leaning towards a candidate of quality or of substance, et cetera, and the target is just arbitrary often, right? There's no substance to the target. It's just a number.
But I think this comes back to, and forgive my simplicity, it comes back to a lack of understanding of how we can genuinely be inclusive, how we can reduce bias and actually create a truly inclusive culture, workforce, whatever that looks like.
And that inclusion bit is an important point here, right? Because actually, when you start thinking about bias in the round, it can be a big derailer of an inclusive culture too, right? If we don't manage it or we don't, coordinate what we do. We'll talk a little bit about what can people do later. But I heard this example a few weeks ago about bias, right? And I don't know how true this is, but it was, third-hand conversation. Somebody was saying to me that they were talking about race bias, so bias against people of color. And for this group of white members of staff, the report was late because the printer was broke, right? So that's why their deadline was missed and the report was late. For this group of people of color, well, you should have known the printer was broke. You should have given yourself more time to make sure the report was in on time. And that bias around the excuse making for why this was and whose fault was at fault. Was it the printer at fault for the people who were white language, or was it the individual's fault because they hadn't planned for the printer might break and therefore you should be more prepared, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how true that is, but there's an element of truth in that I think we don't realize we're doing that often. And at the weekend, I was listening to, I'm a big sports fan, as you know, and at the weekend I was listening to a sports radio show, and they were talking about bias in commentary. And it was a member of the black community, football community, who was saying, when you listen to the commentary on sports channels around footballers in particular, he was saying, the words strength and pace is used so much to describe black players. And yet when they talk about white players, they talk about the skill that they've used and the step overs and the techniques. And, that this description is much more rich when they're talking about white players. When they talk about black players, they talk about strength and pace.
But bring that straight back to the workplace. There's really strong research around performance reviews and the language used in a male performance review, where a male is performance reviewing them, in terms of target and output. Whereas with female, and indeed female on female, it's very much more around care and behaviour. And again, that dynamic is fascinating.
That point you made there then about the female triggered me to remember something. There was a piece of research, and you might remember where this research is from. I'm sorry, I can't remember it, and I haven't written it down to fact check it today, so apologies if you're involved in this research, right? But there was a piece of research that said, and it followed this change. So people were putting a lot of energy into getting more women into their organization, and they'd done that, and they believed that by getting more women into senior leadership positions, it would then be self-perpetuating, right? We would just keep having more women. And the opposite happened.
Absolutely.
Right? The opposite happened. What they ended up with was more men. And everybody was scratching their heads saying, I don't understand. Right? We've put women into senior leadership positions, and the women are recruiting more men, right? And actually, when this research dug into why that is because when you then talked about blue jobs and pink jobs, so come back to the point I made earlier on, even women associate leadership with men, with blue jobs. And it's a bias that women have just as much as men have. And we thought by putting women in, it would be self-perpetuating, and it isn't, because women have the same bias as men and it's there. And the processes didn't support them to make different decisions. They just went down that road. And it was a fascinating bit of research that they'd been followed from start to finish. I can't remember who did it, so apologies, because you deserve some credit for that, because it was interesting research.
But, some of that will be conscious. Conscious choice and conscious bias. And we spend so much time talking about unconscious bias that actually consciousness is the one that's the real killer.
So let's do that. Let's help our listeners understand the difference between the two. How would you describe the difference then between the two?
Well, unconscious is exactly what it says. It is such a fast process that we're not consciously aware of it. So we talk about microseconds of the brain coming to a decision. Somebody walks in this door now, I've categorized them rapidly within microseconds as to whether I like them, whether I don't, would I eat them, mate them, would I employ them?
Probably.
Possibly. All of those simple categorizations, and I will have gone to my own comforts to measure them against them. That's my unconsciousness. But I won't even be aware, because we're talking about microseconds. Whereas in my conscious brain, which kicks in after we talk about 7 seconds, what that can do is give us the opportunity to go to our filing cabinet in our head, have a look through what has our experience been of somebody wearing a blue jumper who's 6'4" and all of those good things, and therefore recategorize a little more sensibly, because our brain will challenge our routes to that decision making in that little bit more time. And I'm a massive fan of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Kahneman,
which is the Nobel Prize-winning book around the importance of just slowing down, which comes right back to the BBC report.
Daniel Kahneman's book, the Thinking Fast and Slow, is, I think you quote this all the time, and it always makes me chuckle. It's the most bought and least read book on the planet, right? Because it's a tough read, isn't it?
People usually get to about the middle of chapter 2 and it sits on the bookshelf. But during COVID, what was hilarious, when everybody had got their books in the background to look clever on the Teams calls, I was counting how many times I saw this book. And just out of a bit of sport, I was going, what did you make of chapter 6? And the amount of people who went, I don't know, I just didn't get there. So.
There is, for those of you that are interested in Daniel's book, there is now an abridged podcast version. And it's a really simple version of it. So do some Googling, you'll find a version that you can actually read and spend some time on. But it is a good book, and the principles of it are really important.
The principles are really powerful. Yeah, they are good.
And we use that quite a lot when we're talking about this topic with clients, right? Because it is a powerful thing. So I'm conscious that we were talking about unconscious bias. So say that with your mouth full. You made this point about unconscious bias being this kind of rapid categorization. And I guess we should make the point then, the bias is not a new fad, is it, right? Because by that very nature, it's been around since the turn of time because we always do that. It's basically fight or flight, right? That's our body keeping us safe, or our mind, our brain keeping us safe often.
And that bias is massively helpful. If I see a truck careering towards me, I don't think, let's think about the most sensible thing I do now. My body will have naturally moved without any consideration. Absolutely. Yeah. So, that we have bias in everything we do. When I chose the schools that my children went to, I went for the best performing schools. Yeah. My bias was that you go for the top of the league table.
Yeah, quite.
And, that happens in everything that we do. But we shouldn't ridicule bias. And for our global listeners, bias as a concept doesn't translate very well.
No.
So, and as a word doesn't translate well. So we just need to be mindful that we're talking about this preference to or against.
Yeah. So we do that quite a lot because of our global client base, we have that kind of challenge. And so we often describe bias as this tendency to move towards or away from something. And it's a nicer way to kind of use it in those global settings. So for organizations that operate globally, talking about bias, you need to be thinking about, does that translate very well to all of your organization? Okay. So I think that was helpful. One of the things I want us to do today when we're talking about bias is I want us to have the honest conversation bit here, right? Because there is some challenge around this stuff, right? And I made a couple of notes that I want to talk through some of this stuff with you because I think it's important that we hit this head on. So there's two bits that I want to talk about. The first one is in 2020, a group of Tory MPs, and I should say, for those of you outside the UK, the Tory party is the Conservative party. It's a political party in the UK. It's a Conservative party. A group of these Tory MPs refused to attend a 2-hour training course on unconscious bias. Now, I don't know the quality of the training for obvious reasons. I wasn't involved. But Ben Bradley, who was the MP at the time, said it was Orwellian and totally nonsensical. That in my role as a representative of a community that has typically been left behind and voiceless for many years, that I should avoid certain words or issues to avoid offence. What do you make of that challenge to attending unconscious bias training? There is a counter argument. I'll come back to that in a second as well. But what do you make of that?
I'd be right behind him. I wouldn't go to an unconscious bias training session if you paid me.
Okay, that's interesting, right? That's interesting. So let me read you the counter argument now, and then we can see what you think about that, right? Because the counter argument to that was from the union, I believe it was the staff union. Let's have a look. The Prospect Union, which represents some public sector workers. And they said Parliament should reject these arguments from MPs and make it mandatory. As Black and Asian colleagues see this as a crucial step in improving their day-to-day working lives, what kind of message does it send to the country if a couple of hours training is too high a price to pay to demonstrate commitment to improving the work experience of colleagues?
Okay. So my argument here would be, so make that meaningful, because absolutely we want to protect and support all of our colleagues with difference. And the reality is unconscious bias is not going to achieve that. By the very nature of what it is, it's uncontrollable.
Yeah.
So therefore, what would be far more sensible is to invest those 2 hours of time in the practical application and of bias and how to overcome it.
Yeah. Or how to overcome the negative side of bias rather than the positive side, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And therefore, the tools to be able to support all of our colleagues and help our own brains to navigate our own biases.
I love that. And the reason I brought this up, because I knew what you were going to say around that, because we've had this debate quite a few times, right? But it is there's an element of sympathy for these MPs who are saying no.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
I question whether the reason they're saying no is aligned to why you're saying no. Probably not. But I guess the point for me here is the quality of the training is really important. And the very nature of just doing unconscious bias training, to your point, is you can't really fix it because it's unconscious and your body will just do, or your brain will just do whatever it thinks is right anyway. You can't stop it. And you wouldn't want to, because to your earlier point, if a lorry's coming towards you, you want your brain to get you out the bloody way instead of walking towards that lorry, right? So you don't necessarily want to tackle unconscious bias anyway.
No, but let's layer with some sympathy here in terms of the fact that, we've all got different experiences. We've all got different points of reference. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be educated in bias by any means, but the behavioural change that is required to actually make a difference on bias is not going to come from a theoretical course.
And not for 2 hours on unconscious bias.
And not for 2 hours.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, and the reason this is important, and, for those of you listening that are leaders of big organizations, I can't count on 2 hands, because I run out of fingers, the amount of clients that have come to me and said, Craig, we have spent £250,000, £500,000 on unconscious bias training and nothing's changed.
Or we've gone backwards.
And I'm like, yeah, sorry about that, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
And it doesn't surprise us, does it?
No, it doesn't. And, I still see it now. Despite all of this scientific research and all of these credible reports around the impact or lack of unconscious bias training. And I find it fascinating. But again, it's back to what people feel comfortable with. Yeah. And because people don't have an alternative and can't walk towards the alternative comfortably, they go with doing something rather than nothing.
Yeah. And I guess the other bit that leads into this honest conversation bit around this topic as well is I have a little bit of sympathy for those resisting this topic too, whether the quality of the training is there or not, right? So even when the quality is there, so let's assume that they're doing good training and it's likely to be impactful and it's focusing on the practical application, people are still resistant of this training or this type of training in organizations. And I have a little bit of sympathy for them around this topic, right? And the reason for that is because by the very nature of you saying to somebody, you need to go on some bias training, it feels quite accusatory, right? It feels like you're accusing me of doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And so therefore, people's instincts is to be defensive. Well, I don't need it. I treat everybody the same. Or I don't, what are you saying about me? And so I guess we've got to get the how we implement this kind of training right as well, because we shouldn't be accusing people or making them feel like they're being accused. Even if we do that by mistake, it is a problem, right?
And it's the tone and the sentiment of training in this entire topic. I know a lot of people who resist general inclusion training. Are you telling me I'm a bigot? I don't need to go on inclusion training. Yeah. And suddenly you're not going to have the impact. But if you're approaching this from a policing point of view or a rules point of view, you're not going to make the behavioural change. And therefore I have great sympathy for these people.
Yeah, because anybody in their very nature would be embarrassed to be thinking I'm biased or, that I treat people differently. Most people don't get up in the morning and think, I'm going to be biased today, right? That's not how humans necessarily behave. I mean, there might be one or two, but most people don't, right?
Yeah.
That's not human nature.
And by over-policing this stuff, we push it underground.
Yeah.
And therefore, we don't talk openly about it or we don't challenge each other. We just create an underground movement of bias.
Yeah. Okay. So we've done the unconscious bias bit, right? And I think we've explained, by very nature, they're snap judgments and people don't realize they're making them because it's unconscious, right? And, some unconscious bias is helpful to us, right? So let's not try and change it altogether. Tell us a little bit more about the conscious stuff then, because this is you're quite passionate about this topic, aren't you? Because people often blame things around here, don't you? And you get very much like, let's have the conversation.
Yeah. So as I've said, everybody's got a different baseline. We've all got different experiences, right? From being 4 years of age when we've started to collect those really tangible memories of whether that be education, parenting, what family means to you, what behaviours you've encountered. And we collect all of those in our brain and we measure people against what we know and what we're comfortable with. So, but that's not exhaustive. No filing cabinet is always full. No data bank is exhausted. We need to keep challenging ourselves on this topic. So I come back to talking about things like if you don't understand a particular religion, for example.
Religion was my weakness, if I'm honest, when we were working in this space, and we've been doing this a long time now, but I think if I was to describe my biggest weakness, religion was it, right? I had very limited. I grew up as a Catholic boy. In the Catholic world, you're told you what to think and how to think and all of that. And I challenged that when I was younger, because I was mouthy and cheeky enough to say to the teachers, "You don't believe that," right? But actually, religion was my weakness, and I didn't really know a lot about other faiths and other religions, and I had to go out and educate myself on some of that.
Absolutely. What did you do?
Well, I have a friend who's Muslim, and that was my first port of call, and I said to my friend, "Can I ask you some questions about this topic?" And he was a bit like, "What?" And then he laughed and said, "Why, are you thinking about converting?" And I was like, "No, I just want to know a bit more." And he thought it was funny, and we had a really good. Anyway, we went out. I bought him some dinner. I learned a bit more, and then actually he invited me to some events with his family, so I could not just know a little bit about it, but I could experience some of it. And I know in future episode we're going to talk about cultural appreciation and appropriation, because there's a fine line as well, right? So I remember going to a Sikh wedding once, right? And they dressed me in a turban and all that. And I was thinking, oh my God, am I overstepping a line here, right? But I guess I was invited. It was one of those things. But yeah, so that's how I learned more about it. But before then, I didn't know a huge amount about different religions. I mean, I could tell you loads about the Catholic religion. It was drummed into me as a child, but not much about any other religion.
But, the point there is you consciously made the decision to build some more information into your data banks. Yeah. And we all have that opportunity to expand our conscious brain to ensure that we've got more reference points against which we're measuring bias.
So I'm going to tell a story now, because I've just thought of something else where I was thrown into getting some experience, right? So I joined an organization a long time ago now, that specialized, and this organization well, but they specialized in supporting people with disabilities, right? And I knew a bit about disabilities at that time, and I had some lived experience of disabilities at home and stuff like that, but not all disabilities. And so, I think I was probably sat in the stereotype thinking around disabilities that people in wheelchairs or physical disabilities rather than disabilities. Anyway, so I'd gone to my first board meeting, right, in this new organization. So I'm sat there around this big board table on these big chairs, and I'm sat towards the front, and we were having a guest speaker to this meeting. And in hindsight now, I think my boss at the time, the CEO at the time, knew what she was doing, right? And she was throwing me in at the deep end, right? But so I'm sat right at the front. The speaker's a foot away from me. And when he starts talking, he's shouting and really shouting and in a really kind of different voice. And I just kind of sat back and every fiber of my being, and I mean every fiber of my being, had to hold back laughter. Yeah. And it wasn't because I was laughing at the individual, but it was because I was so shocked. My body just reacted with laughter, because if it wasn't going to laugh, it was going to cry. But of course, I didn't want to laugh in front of this guy or in front of my colleagues that I didn't know was brand new. And so I'm sat in this chair, dying a slow and painful death while this chap was speaking. And what he was saying was really emotional and really moving. But my whole body had reacted in such a way. And it's funny how your body reacts to stuff as well, right? Because I was under this inordinate amount of pressure, and I didn't want to embarrass myself, and I certainly didn't want to offend anybody. And I was just like, every fibre of my being. And I said to my boss afterwards, you could have warned me. And she said, you should have prepared.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, she's right. I should have prepared. I should have understood who was coming. I should have understood the organization I was working with. I should have done my bloody homework. And she was right?
Yeah.
But I just remember that day. It was soul destroying because me and the chap now are friends. We still speak to each other. A lovely guy, and he didn't bat an eyelid. But I think it was a deliberate exercise in helping me quickly understand the organization I was working with.
It's a great example of building that consciousness, isn't it? It's making sure we don't also get bogged down with the big stuff, because that's a big story.
Yeah.
The reality is mine is a tongue piercing.
Yeah.
So, I encounter that quite often. And if I'm interviewing for my business or on behalf of one of my clients, I have to check myself because that dates back to a childhood experience where one of my friends had their tongue pierced. It went badly wrong. They ended up with this huge growth and took great delight in showing us all. And my brain goes to, ugh, as opposed to, oh, that's interesting. Why would you do that? And, I've got a colleague who has a huge aversion to heavily pregnant women. And that all sounds very strange and funny until you understand that they had a traumatic experience and it takes them back to a place, and therefore they can't concentrate on that individual as strongly. Can be the colour of a jacket. Yeah. It can be absolutely anything that takes you back into your conscious data bank to go, oh, I felt that way. Therefore, everybody who wears an orange jacket will make me feel that way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you're right. It's those lived experiences, isn't it? And sometimes they're good and sometimes they're indifferent and sometimes they're not so good. And we've got to be able to try and navigate those lived experiences because they will affect our decision-making and the way we behave.
Yeah.
So this is where that kind of slowing down your thinking and all of that good stuff comes in, and where we can start to build up our data banks with more rich resources around experience and lived experience, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. A couple of other things I just wanted to run through because it's an interesting one. I'm not going to do the surgeon story because I think most people will probably have heard the surgeon story. And if you haven't heard it, you can Google it and they'll tell you that story. But that links a bit into the unconscious, right? But I do want to talk a little bit about bias in the workplace and the processes we have, right? Because we try and tackle bias certain ways and we end up making it worse, or we end up changing the situation, right? But I'm going to start with this bit of research that was done with academics, by academics. So the academics did this test on other academics, right? And they gave these academics 2 CVs and asked them to score the CVs on a scale of 7 about who they would pick for the role and what salary they would offer as part of this exercise. And bear in mind, this is academics now. And so they gave the exact same CV. The only thing they did differently was they changed the name. And the name they put on the CV was John and Jennifer, right? So a gender difference. And the results were really fascinating, even from academics. John scored a 4. And they believed would get a salary of around, I can't remember the exact figure, 35 grand, let's say 35 for argument's sake. And Jennifer, with exactly the same CV, scored a 3 with a salary offer of £26,000. How fascinating is that?
Yeah. And, I'd want layers of information to comment, wouldn't you? I'd want to know the profile of the individuals, their backgrounds.
Do you know what I thought was fascinating? Because they didn't go into too much detail, but what they did say was the split between male and female assessors, so the people scoring the CVs, was the same. Women scored in the same way as the men. It wasn't any different between the two.
So is that bias or is that toxicity?
Wow, good question. Yeah.
It's an interesting one, isn't it?
But the CV thing is an interesting one, right? And this is where I kind of link it to something that you will probably say, and I'll let you say that in a second. But we see a lot now, organizations removing names from CVs, don't we?
We do, indeed.
And what's the consequence of doing that? Are we tackling the bias by doing that?
So there's a few things to consider, isn't there? About 5 years, it was in vogue to do blind CVs, remove absolutely everything.
No age.
Sterilise the whole
No education
process.
dates because you can work out the age. No names.
Yeah, exactly. And what we found was, particularly during COVID, was that because it became a very faceless process, individuals were meeting their candidates who'd perhaps been in post for 6 or 12 months during COVID for the first time and were being openly discriminatory because they hadn't had the experience of interview where they would have been able to be biased and move these people out of the process. I'm not saying that's right, just to be clear.
Yeah.
But the reality is that they were meeting people on the first day and going, "Oh, hi, I didn't realise you were in a wheelchair."
Yeah.
And direct discrimination.
Yeah. And it's true, right? So you removed the bias from the screening process, maybe even the interview process, because if a line manager's doing the interview and you're selecting them, but you're just pushing the bias further into the process, aren't you? You're not actually tackling the bias, you're just moving it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by which point it's 5 times more damaging than it would have been.
Because they're working for us, and now we're treating them differently. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Exactly.
So it's an interesting one, isn't it, that blind sifting? Because a lot of people are doing that, I think still doing that. And the other thing we're seeing now to try and tackle bias, which I like where possible, but is this diverse interview panels as well. So they're making the makeup of an interview panel deliberately diverse so that we're, one man, one woman, or person of color or whatever, right, where possible. Now, in all bigger organizations, I guess that's a little bit easier, but there's some pitfalls to that too, right?
There's definitely pitfalls to that because, again, we've all got bias and our baselines are entirely different. Just because we do a tokenistic, beautifully inclusive board or beautifully inclusive panel doesn't suddenly mean that we're inclusive.
Yeah.
So, yeah, huge pitfalls. The other dimension we need to think about, of course, is the introduction of more and more AI into the recruitment processes. And, I've got a son who's going through some very demanding graduate interviews at the moment, 4, 6, 7 hours worth of bot interviews effectively. And if your facial expressions or your reaction isn't right, you don't get through to the next question, let alone the next round.
Yeah.
So
it's quite aggressive now, isn't it? Yeah.
Very aggressive, rightly competitive, but very aggressive. And therefore, we come back to the bias in AI. We come back to what that means to people who have difference and all of those good things that will mean that we've got modern biases coming into play.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess the other thing about interview panels, which I find quite fascinating, is so I have a client who was doing these diverse interview panels, the DIPs as they call them, and I thought, this is quite interesting. So I went and had a little nosy and see what's what. And they have a lead on their panel. And I go, oh, right, okay. Tell me more about the lead on the interview panel. Well, yes, this person's the lead. And I'm like, right, okay. So do they get the deciding vote? And they go, yeah. And I go, well, you haven't solved your problem then, right?
Yeah,
because if they get the deciding vote, then their bias is going to take the presiding. It's just a willy fight of who's got the biggest bias now, right?
Absolutely. We've got HR on the panel. Fabulous. Do they have a vote? Oh, no, they're there to facilitate.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. And that's what I mean, right? So people think they're fixing some of this stuff with blind sifting or diverse interview panels, but actually there are also issues with that. You could be pushing the bias further in, or you could just be favoring a particular type of bias within those interview panels and all of that kind of stuff as well. And it's all well intended, isn't it, to tackle some of this stuff, but it just isn't necessarily robust.
Yeah. And I think this whole topic of bias is, you used the word fearful earlier. I think the problem is we have turned this word into such a negative word. To be accused of being biased is as bad as being accused of being racist. And we are petrified in the workplace of being that person, because once our reputation is damaged with those kinds of words, it just pushes us into fear.
Yeah.
And our behaviour isn't about how do I do this better? It's about how do I avoid it altogether?
Yeah. But you've got brand reputation to think about as well, right? And that's fearful for then leaders to think, oh God, our process has got to be robust. And then they lean one way because they think they're protecting the organization. But we also know there are people who make a living from applying to jobs and changing names on CVs and stuff to see if they get different responses. So the way we educate people involved in the recruitment processes within our organization is equally important to protect the organization, because there are people that make a career out of applying, using different types of CVs to get you to, favor one over another and then take you to court for it.
Absolutely. And I think, I feel really compassionately for the recruitment sector.
Yeah.
It's close to my heart. And, professional recruiters will genuinely do everything they can to support their candidates. Clearly, with the introduction of more technology, there's less human intervention. But where there is, people make mistakes.
Yeah, but AI makes mistakes.
AI makes mistakes.
So we're involved with some AI technology at the moment, and we challenge constantly about who's written the instructions to the AI, because the bias just comes from whoever's written it. So how are we testing the bias of the technology? The bias of the AI is also equally as important as whether our processes, the manual processes, are tried, tested, and robust enough to withstand bias being infused into those processes as well.
No, definitely. And, our recruiters, you would hope, have had robust training. They've come through the REC routes. They've done their exams, all of that good stuff. When we come to the hiring managers, who are subject matter experts in their own field, not recruitment experts, suddenly they're faced with a very, very heavily legislative piece of work to do for all the reasons you've just said. If they say the wrong word, if they ask the wrong question, and we've got to remove this fear for people.
Yeah. So let's do that. Let's remove the fear. So what? What can leaders, listeners do in order to try and mitigate the negative consequences of bias in our workplaces and our organizations? What are the top tips from you, Dawn, to do that?
The first is self-reflection. Be mindful of yourself and accept that you've got bias. We've all got them. And have your antennae up when you know that you're in that situation of bias.
Yeah.
The second would be a robust education process that is focused on the behavioural change and how that can impact you in the workplace.
Can I just jump in there as well, just to be clear? When we talk about behaviour change and education alone is not enough.
No.
Right? So as an organization, it's not enough just to put some training in place. You've got to make sure that your systems and your processes also drive people to then make the change that you're educating them on. Because if your systems and processes don't do that, they'll just revert to type and you won't see a difference in your value for your money. So you'll spend, as we've seen with other clients, £250,000, £500,000 on training, whether the quality of the training is good or not. If you haven't done the process bit as well, you might as well have not done the training, right?
Exactly that. Personal curiosity is important. Making sure that if you know you've got gaps, start with the protected characteristics, like you've said, religion, the sexuality, etc., and fill in some of those gaps. And again, making sure that we support each other in this. If we can see somebody's made a mistake, just tap them in line gently. Don't vilify them. Don't hold them up as an example of what not to do. It could be us. We all make mistakes. So support them through that and just remove the pressure and the anxiety around this topic.
Yeah, love that. And there's a bit we should think about tackling bias from two angles, right? So you can do it from the individual level. So we all have a responsibility to think about where our gaps are, how we can expand our networks, and what can we personally do to educate ourselves to be more alert and understand what's going on. But equally, there's, I guess, just leaning into that, being more curious, right? Because we seem to, as adults, lost the ability to be curious. But we also then need to think of it from the employer perspective. So what can employers do on this? And this is the bit that says education, but also processes. And I'm conscious that we've spoken quite a lot about recruitment today, but there are other processes, right, where bias plays or can play quite a negative impact in your organization. Talk us through some of those.
Absolutely. So even down to the day-to-day of who we allocate a piece of work to. So making sure that our managers and our leaders are confident to mentor somebody in how to do a task or how to navigate their career or whatever that may be, so that we give everybody equal exposure to that knowledge. Things like progression, putting robust progression and succession planning in place that isn't Bob because Bob's my mate who I go to play football with on a Wednesday.
The progression one's really interesting. I did a piece of work recently for a client where we were reviewing their succession planning exercise. And I'd said to them, can I see the last 3 years documents? And they were like, 3 years? Or we've only brought last year's. And I'm like, no, I want to see 3 years. And they couldn't get their head around why I wanted 3 years worth of data. And actually, once I then went through the 3 years worth of data with them and explained to them, but can you see this person has been on this succession plan for 3 years and hasn't moved, which tells me they're on there to tick some box or a number rather than for true progression and true. And this is why we talk about data being quite important, isn't it? Because you take a snapshot in time, but the snapshot's not enough. You've got to keep measuring that as you go forward, because we see it quite a lot, particularly with succession planning. Someone's pulled them up on, have you got enough diversity in your succession plan? So they pop some diversity in, and it just sits there for 3 years or whatever, rather than actually being part of a true succession plan, progression, development opportunities, these kind of things. And it drives me insane when I see it.
But it materializes in exit. So, sure. If we look at the bias in the profile of people who exit, whether that be against characteristic, whether that be about behavioural traits, whatever that might be, you'll see exactly where the department, the manager, or the organisation is biased.
Well, you actually can't you? Data can tell you quite a lot. There's an example that I thought was quite a powerful one, because I think we talked about this before. Some organisations take this seriously. Some organisations are reactive to bias as a problem, and therefore then they put some robust measures in place. One that I thought was really interesting was, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, but Starbucks had an incident of a racial incident in one of their stores, and their team was accused of being biased based on this. And Starbucks' reaction to that, I thought, was quite robust, actually. They closed every single store for a whole day, and every single employee was given some bias training, which, to be fair, I don't know the quality of it, but looked on the surface to be decent bias training. In response to that. And I thought that was quite a powerful statement from Starbucks. They wanted to nip that in the bud very, very quickly. That's not who they were as an organization. And that commitment to close, I mean, I'm sure their shareholders weren't overly impressed that their stores shut for a whole 24 hours in order to do that. But actually, the brand loyalty they got as a result of taking swift, robust action in response to that incident, because it was quite a negative incident. You remember it? It was in the States, I think, and there was quite a big thing about it. It wasn't long after Black Lives Matter and all of that kind of stuff. So it was a big, robust statement that they made. But actually, I think it benefited them as an organization to have taken that robust action. I do question, I mean, I don't know the detail because Starbucks aren't one of my clients, so I can't comment. So I don't know what's happened since and whether they followed that up and whether they're tracking it, whatever. But I thought in the moment that was quite a powerful statement.
I think in the moment it was good. I would love to go in and see what impact it made 2 years later and just test the robustness of that training and how it landed. And what a beautiful piece of PR for them.
Yeah, quite. But equally, if they did nothing, then that would have been really negative, right? So, we can't criticize people for doing something.
No.
And I thought their response was good in the moment. I am, like you, fascinated to go and see. I'd love to see the data. I'd love to see what, as a result of that, the impact's been. But, organizations, my advice to you is don't have to do a Starbucks. Try and get ahead of that by being proactive rather than reactive.
I was going to say, my cynicism comes from the after the incident, because if we can work on prevention,
better.
We don't need to do a big PR campaign.
Or close your stores and lose revenue for a whole day, right? Yeah, quite. But in the moment, they responded to having to do what they needed to do. But I would be much more in the camp of, let's get ahead of this. Let's prepare ourselves and prepare our people. And actually, let's also relax about this, right? Let's create a speak up culture in our organization that allows people to say, can I just mention, can I just challenge, can I just say this about bias? Because again, some leaders, some people might not even realize they've made a mistake. And there are different types of biases that lead us into that. So do you want to comment on some of those different types of biases? Because, I'm thinking of benevolent bias as an example here, right? And we see it quite a lot where leaders will say, oh, well, I didn't ask Craig to do that piece of work because he's a single parent and he might not want to travel, right? It's lovely sentiment, but actually that's my decision, not yours, right? And so the bias there is, I'm trying to be kind to Craig by not asking him to go traveling. But actually, it's not your decision to make. Thank you very much. It's mine. But there are lots of examples of that where people think they're doing good, but actually are causing problems, right?
And there's 170
170 of them. And do you know them all? Shall we test you right now?
I can hand on heart say no. Just coming back to that point, sorry, and I will answer your question. The importance here, of course, is to make sure that we are robust in what we're actually teaching. And that doesn't have to be complex.
No.
So again, back to that measurement. There are tons of different biases. So confirmation bias, where we make a decision about somebody in the first few seconds and we spend the rest of the conversation convincing ourselves and confirming ourselves we were right. The classic horns and halos. Somebody walks in and we recognise that they look like somebody we really liked previously, and therefore they're going to be great. The classic bias of beauty bias, which talks about if you look like a previous successful post holder, you're more likely to be appointed because simply by looks, you will be associated with success.
There's some stats on beauty bias as well, isn't there?
Massive.
Like I want to say in the States,
I've got them.
Do you know? Go on, tell us the stats here, because I was going to just do it off the cuff and get it all wrong. So you tell us what the stats are.
Yeah, so there's an interesting statistic around female and weight.
Yeah.
In that for every 1 stone, which would be about 6 kilograms, the price differential in pay is £1,500 per 6 kilograms.
So you lose 1,500 quid in pay, more overweight you are for every stone you're overweight.
Yeah. So that's a really
interesting
piece of
earn a
research.
bit more cash.
And then looking at the profile of height in terms of chief executives in the US, where 60% are over 6'2", whereas actually we've only got a population of about 18% who are over 6'2". So we naturally associate the tall, masculine,
leaders,
robust
power,
individual with being a powerful leader. Yeah, there's lots and lots that we could talk
all
about.
These different, but we're not going to talk about them.
No.
Google them. You can go and search it for yourselves. Okay, I'm very conscious that we're this is a longer episode than perhaps we normally do. So hopefully we've given you some ideas around how you can tackle this topic and given you some education around the pitfalls of it. But it's now time to hand over the mic to our listeners. So this is the point in the show where we take some listener questions, and Evan, our fabulous Evan, will be in shortly, I'm sure, with the envelope, because we get the questions sealed. We don't see them before the event. So we're going to put you on the spot today.
Hi, Evan.
And answer some questions. Thanks, Evan. And so this is where we answer some good questions. Let's have a look what people have written for us today. So, can focusing too much on bias in certain areas lead to ignoring or downplaying of bias in other areas?
That's a lovely question. Yeah.
Good question. I
mean, the simple answer is yes. We can overcompensate for some things. So back to our simple examples of we overfocus on female and to the detriment of our male colleagues. Absolutely it can.
But the same in process, right? And we just talked about it a second ago. We've done it today. We've talked a lot about recruitment, but actually things like appraisals, things like work allocation, performance, all of that kind of stuff is also areas that we should consider where bias plays a role. And we often just go straight to recruitment, don't we? Because it's the most obvious one. So actually, it's a really good point. And again, as an organization, when you're thinking about interventions to try and mitigate the negative effects of bias, take a more broad view and think about them on a wider lens and process as well as areas of bias. Yeah, it's a really good question. I like that. How should we engage with people who are skeptical of unconscious bias? What evidence or arguments are most effective in persuading those who aren't already on board? We've kind of covered that with the honest conversation bit. Have some sympathy, because if your training isn't great and you're only training on unconscious bias, then we'd probably be behind them and supporting their challenge. So make sure that the education that you are doing is robust. And don't forget to explain the why, right? Help people understand why we're talking about bias in the first place, because we do say, everybody needs to go through bias training, right? And it's because we're trying to tackle X, but actually we should explain the why, in that everybody has bias. It's not a bad thing, but we are trying to mitigate some of the negative effects of bias on individuals. Help people understand what that would mean for them or for their family members or people that are close to them.
And the power of difference.
Yeah. Exactly that. Love that. Okay, that was a good question. Really enjoyed that one. Is it fair to assume everyone from a different demographic is biased in the same ways? How should we account for individual differences in experiences and beliefs when addressing bias?
It's great, because everybody's benchmark is different. Yeah. Everybody's data bank is different. Everybody's experience is different. And if we consider, again, focusing on some characteristics, the experience of individuals, whether that be from different ethnicities, whether that be from different races, whether that be from different religions, will be a different baseline to who we may be dealing with.
And I think this is where your training is going to be really important, right? And this plays into the point that you made earlier about the quality of the training and that kind of stuff, because actually it isn't enough just for the organization to do some training, even make some changes to their process. The individual has to take some responsibility here as well, right? And we have to understand how our experiences are going to lean us towards, or this tendency towards something rather than away from something. We've got to take a bit of personal responsibility for what our biases will look and be like, and admit that we've got them, right? Because everyone's got them, because they're based on your experiences, and just accept that that's a fact, but understand what that looks like. So for me, my responsibility was I had very limited experience of religion, so I actively went out and did that. If more people did that, then the baseline doesn't really matter, because we're self-mitigating, we're self-managing how the effects of bias will play, right?
And, even more so in terms of, our colleagues within our organisations of different races, different ethnicities, and their experiences, and how that has been entirely different to people who perhaps consider themselves to be white British.
Yeah. The next question is about what steps can individuals take to challenge their own biases. We've talked through some of those, but expand your networks, expand your experiences, slow down your thinking, read Daniel Kahneman's, listen to his podcast, all of that kind of good stuff. But essentially take a bit of ownership and a bit of responsibility as individuals. I think it's quite important one. Can you share a pivotal moment in your career when bias became a visible issue you had to address? Wow. Love that question.
Like that.
I could probably share one straight off the bat. So when I started my career, I started in the pub industry, in the hospitality sector. And I joined as a barman, and I very quickly moved my way up into senior leadership, and I became the youngest pub manager in the company, very, very young. And the amount of bias I got as a result, not just from colleagues, but from customers, because I was the unit manager and I was young and whatever, was untrue. Genuinely, it was every single day I had a comment about my age and how I was too young to be doing what I was doing and to lead and all of that good stuff. Now, look, regardless of what people might think about that, I grew up in pubs. I spent my childhood in pubs. I knew more about pubs than people would ever know, right? So my experience was what was valuable, was what got me to that place. My knowledge of the sector, the management of it all, and the leadership stuff I learned as I went. And I had some great training, great leadership training with this organization. And I'm a big fan of theirs to this day because of the effort they put into shaping my leadership style. But actually, the amount of bias I got based purely on my age, and clearly because I'm, so youthful looking and all of that, only 27 and all. But yeah, massive amount of bias because of my age.
Mine would be being the only woman in the room. And this example goes back 35 years. Yeah. So, I'm talking about an environment where to be an aspiring female exec, as I was then, I was put into a wage negotiation back in the days of John Prescott and George Lawson and some pretty robust union negotiation. And I had to go onto a night shift of a logistics organisation where we were delivering a pay negotiation, very intense, very difficult. And I went along to present an offer. And the treatment and the comments that I got was startling.
Wow.
And I can remember having been positioned as a professional. And, I was straight out of uni. I'd got a very significant mentor. They'd put me in this position because they felt I was ready. And one of the guys at the front went, oh, she's not a professional. She's a prostitute because she's female. And I'm there to do this wage negotiation. I'll never forget it. And I can remember thinking,
Did you kick their ass?
I absolutely kicked their ass. And they got 2% less than they would have got had they not been so rude. But that was a moment where I thought, I'm going to have to work 10 times harder here.
Yeah. Well, that leads into that final question, I think. So the final question is, how can bias affect leadership? Massively affect leadership, I think. And one of the biggest ways it affects leadership is confidence, I think, particularly for new leaders starting out, progressing through the ranks. If they're exposed to difficult bias in those early days of their leadership and their learning of leadership, it can massively affect their confidence. It can massively affect their capability, right? Because they will be second guessing themselves. There will be, and it's, I believe, the responsibility of the organization to put support and structure around those leaders in the early days to enable or to ensure that things like bias doesn't derail their ability to be good leaders or to progress in leadership. And you just mentioned mentors and stuff. That's a big way for organizations to put that support in place, I think.
And I think that's absolutely right. I think I would just add to that, though, that often we can have positive bias as leaders as a result of our own experience. The experience I've just shared meant that I was determined to champion other female professionals.
Yeah.
And therefore, I know
Let's not do that episode today.
I have a bias towards that.
Yeah. No, it's really important, and I do think it has a big effect. So, but again, responsibilities on the organisation to put the support in place for sure. Okay, well, that's it for the questions this week. So, if you've got some questions, send them as always to evan@metimer.global. Metimer.global, and Evan will wrap them up in a nice envelope and present them to us at the pod. So don't be afraid to be challenging. Don't be afraid to ask us the honest or difficult questions around the topic of cultural appreciation and appropriation as well. We look forward to hearing them. And that brings us towards the end of the show and our recurring feature, which is Woke or Joke. So, Dawn, I believe it's your turn to do Woke or Joke this week, and I get the pleasure of trying to guess where we are. So, for those of you that aren't aware, Woke or Joke is our recurring feature where one of us will bring something to the table each week, and we have to challenge the other person to guess whether it's a woke story, true story, or a joke story. And I can't remember what score we're on at the moment, but I'm losing, basically.
So I've been scouring to try and make sure.
You really want me to buy you dinner, don't you?
I want this dinner. So this is quite an interesting one. So I've found something which talks about a man who has been fired from their role for the excessive use of emojis in some client communications. Now, he's argued...
I know this story. No, I don't. I'm joking. Sorry.
Is it our business? No. He argued back, saying that as a result of being stifled, his creativity was being blocked. So that was his argument in the case.
So let me get this right. So he's been fired for using emojis.
Too many emojis
in
with
messages
his customers.
And with his customers, right, okay.
But
So they just fired him or they told him to stop and then he didn't stop?
He didn't stop because he felt that would be stunting his creativity.
Oh my God. It's so hard. Like, it's one of these things, isn't it, that could be true.
It's a good one, isn't it?
I don't want it to be true. I don't want it to be true because it's got to be a joke. But the way I'm doing this lately, I'm getting them so wrong. So I'm just going to go the opposite and I'm going to say it's true. It's woke.
I'm glad to say it's false.
Oh! Every time. So I was trying to second guess myself then and be really clever and then just messed it up. Okay, brilliant. So if you have a woke or joke that you'd like to send through, you can also send them through to Evan, who will select one of us to read them out. So evan@metimer.global for your questions or a woke or joke if you want to put one to us as well, because I'm not doing very well at these whole woke or joke things. So please somebody help me out because I need some.
Thanks to everybody who's sending me them. Keep scouring.
Well, we're coming towards the end of the episode, so thank you for listening. Hope you found some useful tips around bias. It is a big topic. It's a longer episode today than we normally do, but I think it's an important topic for us to have covered. I guess if I was to sum up where we got to with bias is you should do training. We should be doing something about bias in organizations, but the quality of that training and the quality of the work you do has to be robust enough. And you're not going to fix people's unconscious bias with a little 2-hour training. So please don't bother trying and understand that that's where the resistance comes from. Is that fair, sum up?
I love that.
Excellent.
Very clear.
Okay, well, that's it from us. Thank you for tuning in to You Must Be Woking for another episode. And it's bye from me.
And bye from me.
You Must Be Woking is brought to you by Metimer Global, where measuring inclusion matters. Visit www.metimer.global or check out our socials, Metimer Global.